I was over the moon when I traded for my first Baneslayer Angel. What a card! It was extraordinarily expensive. It was making waves in Standard, and pros were lamenting that it heralded the death of magic. To me, that Chase Mythic was the glowing exemplar of a good creature. It went straight into my cube, where it remained for a few years. Ultimately, though, I fell out of love with Baneslayer and cards like it. I'd like to confess why our torrid affair ended. Welcome to Cultic Cube, where we cube religiously. We make you better at cube, and make your cube better. The term Baneslayer Angel is often used as shorthand for any relatively high casting cost creature that is a must-answer threat, but that has little value once answered. It is typically a stat monster with good combat abilities. In this video, I will explain the Mulldrifter versus Baneslayer theory of creature value. We will think about Baneslayers in relation to the Vindicate Test, and consider the test's relevance today. Finally, we will identify other creatures in the Baneslayer genre, and examine spells that might be good replacements for them. Allow me to interject a quick announcement that you can now support Cultic Cube via Patreon. I have a number of exciting perks for supporters. Rest assured that this video series is and will remain free for everyone to consume. Patrons get some extra icing and sprinkles on the cake, however. Patrick Chapin wrote a foundational article in 2011 that lumped Magic's creatures into two categories, Mulldrifters and Baneslayer Angels. The value of a Baneslayer Angel is inherent to the creature itself, and is conditional on its presence on the board. The Mulldrifter, by contrast, creates value that does not rely on its body. Chapin has since expanded this schema, but here we will focus on its original articulation. As always, the video description below features links to all of the resources that we discuss. Baneslayer Angel's introduction in Core Set 2010 famously signaled Wizards' push to make creatures central to the Magic experience, to drive interaction toward the battlefield and away from the stack. When Baneslayer is juxtaposed with her ancestor, Serra Angel, who was a feature of competitive decks until 1996, Serra comes out worse for the comparison. Even from the perspective of 2019, Baneslayer is impressive, despite 10 years of creature power creep. A fundamental reason for my aversion to the card in Cube has to do with the so-called Vindicate Test. I want to build a more nuanced argument than simply she dies to removal, but let us begin with the basics. Vindicate is, of course, sorcery speed spot removal. A creature is said to fail the Vindicate Test if it is susceptible to a removal spell, costs more resources to put into play than to cast the kill spell, and gets no value if it is taken off the board before engaging in combat. Casting cost matters, because Vindicate typically trades 1-for-1 in terms of cards. However, if it trades up in resources, it is generally a tempo-positive play. When Vindicate trades down, it is itself tempo-negative. If a red deck's Goblin Guide gets Vindicated, this is a sign that the game is going pretty well for the red mage. A 4 CMC creature is right on the border, whereby some people give these creatures a pass from the test and some do not. It is certainly the case that the more expensive a creature is, the more seriously we should treat a creature's failure in this evaluation. As Vindicate is a sorcery, some people will sometimes supplement its test with a related measure, called the Terminate Test. This examines whether a creature accrues any value before one passes the turn to the opponent. Typically, a creature that passes the Terminate Test will perforce pass the Vindicate Test as well, leaving aside corner cases such as protection from instants. The most well-known example of a creature that fails the Terminate Test, but passes the Vindicate Test, is Consecrated Sphinx. If one draws 2 cards off of the Sphinx, and makes the opponent spend a card removing it, one has reaped reasonable reward for one's mana investment. Mulldrifters, in contrast to Baneslayers, have most of their value tied up in effects off of the battlefield, and thus pass both instant and sorcery speed removal tests. These cards usually have enters the battlefield, leaves the battlefield, or recursive abilities. When one casts Mulldrifter proper, and it is immediately killed, one has already secured the value of Divination, at 3 mana. Thus the removal spell trades for a Winddrake that one effectively bought at the bargain price of 2 colorless mana. Of course, most cubes do not run Divination, and in fact I do not run Mulldrifter anymore. But you see the point that despite the fact that Mulldrifter has the same converted mana cost as a Baneslayer, if this card trades 1-for-1 for a Vindicate, one is additionally up 2 cards for a net increase in resources. Before getting into why I do not like Baneslayers, let me first state that the Vindicate Test is absolutely not the be-all and end-all of card evaluation, any more than is the so-called vanilla test that compares a creature's stats to its mana cost. My friend Andy Mangold recently wrote an essay on the Vindicate Test, which offers the useful admonition that if we were to take this test as a definitive measure of creature value, we would conclude that Staunch Defenders is a better card than Baneslayer Angel. As I see it, Baneslayers can absolutely win games in a spectacular way. I will, for the moment, use actual Baneslayer as a test case for the broader category, though later we will consider other cards that fit the same mold. The Angel is most likely to secure such memorable victory in mid-range decks. This is not in and of itself a problem, but given the limited number of slots we cube curators devote to mana-intensive cards, I would prefer that the card have application elsewhere too. I do not believe that anyone claims that Baneslayer belongs in a combo deck, but I have seen people argue that it is appropriate as top-end in aggro, or as a finisher in control. I have not found either of these theaters to be the best home for Baneslayer. My aggro decks are not much interested in cards that cost more than 4 mana. I would prefer to add another 1-drop to my deck. This allows me to lower my land count and to avoid a dead card in my opening hand. My first videos on this channel, by the by, articulate my approach to building white and red aggro decks. It is more common for people to understand the card as a good control finisher. Here's the problem. Classically, the control deck despises creatures and tries to insulate itself from them, particularly by girding itself with sweepers. One's own creatures are thus vulnerable to one's defensive measures. But more importantly, if the control deck has not been playing any creatures, or none worth killing, then the opponent's creature removal is rotting in their hand. Playing a Baneslayer turns on the opponent's removal at a stroke. Of course, one may have objections, such as the fact that the control deck can hold up counter magic and protect its threat. While this is true, this means that Baneslayer proper costs 3 white-white-blue-blue for actual counterspell backup. The control deck can find better finishers that are stickier, more resilient threats at a better rate, as we will discuss in a bit. Second, it is sometimes argued that actual Baneslayer is outstanding against red aggro, and therefore warrants inclusion in control lists. It is true that red cannot beat this card, as it makes racing impossible, it eats every creature red can throw at it, and one is obliged to 2-for-1 oneself with double bolts to shoot it down. This does not make Baneslayer a unilaterally good card though. This makes it good against one specific matchup. My friend SirFunchalot has written about this, and he makes the case that Baneslayer is effectively a sideboard card. Another common objection is that Baneslayers can undoubtedly win games of Magic, so they create suspense and anticipation when they hit the board. Does the opponent have the Doomblade? The value that one places on such tension is a matter of play preference. I am not especially interested in fostering environments in which winning or losing comes down to a coin flip about whether one sticks one's Baneslayer or not. But I can entirely understand the visceral attraction of playing splashy creatures and riding them to victory. If this is a model that sounds desirable to you, then by all means play Baneslayers. Another motivation to run exactly Baneslayer is the desire to curate a so-called museum cube. A recent episode of the Solely Singleton podcast interviewed Anthony Avitollo, who is co-host of the Third Power podcast. Among the goals of Anthony's cube is to showcase iconic cards from throughout Magic's storied history. If your aims are similar to Anthony's, then Baneslayer, and perhaps other cards in a similar category, are a perfect fit. I would be remiss if I did not mention that Baneslayer's viability in a given cube is properly understood in relation to the density of removal that surrounds it. Baneslayers thrive when access to kill spells is restricted, whereas I maintain a relatively removal-rich environment. Cubes that run lighter on spot removal and sweepers will find that Baneslayers are more reliable. We have been thinking almost exclusively about one particular card, of course, but this card is emblematic of a class of creatures that may be found in each color. Moreover, some recent cards that have made a splash in cubes similarly suffer from the Baneslayer problem. Doom Whisperer is extremely aggressively costed, but I have found it to have too little upside when it eats a Vindicate. Of course, one may pay life and scry 2 in response to removal, but this is a meager consolation prize. Similarly, Questing Beast underwhelmed in my testing. This card only costs 4, which may put it in a different category from the typical Baneslayer. But despite the many words in the card's text box, the card does not offer much if it simply dies. If haste were traded for flash, the card would be more viable. What, you may ask, do I recommend instead of this set of cards? Of course, the first response is mole drifters, creatures with good abilities. And second, creatures that have built-in resilience that invites opponents to 2-for-1 themselves to get rid of it. Angel of Sanctions is actually the only white 5 CMC creature that I am currently running in my 450, and it exemplifies these desirable characteristics, as it has a great ETB, and it has built-in recursion. Cavalier of Gales operates somewhat similarly. I'm not in love with God Eternal Bantu, but I think it is actually a better card than Doom Whisperer. And just to point out the obvious, Thragtusk is the green mole drifter par excellence. These days, there is a long list of 5 CMC white creatures that I prefer over Baneslayer. Angel of Invention, Thalia's Lancers, and Archangel Avacyn top the list, and I rather like the lesser armies in a can as well, such as Regal Caracal and Cloudgoat Ranger. You will notice that all but one of these is a mole drifter, and Avacyn, while a Baneslayer, has Flash, so she at least dodges Vindicate. None of these cards are typically suited to control decks, though. Control decks in particular, but also mid-range decks, should think about diversifying their threats. One may lean into artifacts such as equipment or vehicles. Batterskull is a little slow these days, but it is difficult to remove. Vehicles are generally not amazing in control, although they can be quite good in mid-range. This class of card is hardened against sorcery speed removal, and I have found that Ether Harvester is a fine addition to certain control shells. Planeswalkers are, of course, sterling control finishers, and good mid-range tools. It is not difficult to find walkers that have some combination of the following traits: excellent defense, card advantage, and game-winning threat. I have a recent video in which I argue for increasing Planeswalker density in one's cube. I would draw particular attention to 2 recent Planeswalkers. Mu Yanling Skydancer is much better than many people give her credit for. It is a bit hyperbolic, but not totally crazy to argue that she is pretty close to a 3-mana air elemental with Suspend 1. And Sarah the Benevolent is self-evidently quite pushed. For starters, she is actually a 4-mana Sarah Angel. I asked you all on Twitter for your favorite non-creature, non-planeswalker control finishers, or rewards, and you all offered a wealth of options. These range from cards for Pauper to powered vintage lists, from sorceries to enchantments, and from deal 20s to alternate win cons. Let us briefly consider a couple of control lists that went 3-0 in my cube, and that generally avoid creatures. These deck lists are linked in the video description. The first is a Denier Death, with a few cheapish creatures to help preserve life total. It has quite a bit of early interaction in the form of hand disruption, spot removal, and permission. Jace and Will do not end games on their own, though they are excellent, but Yanling can take over with birds. The deck closes the game by stealing opposing threats, clearing the board and sticking a Batterskull, and/or overwhelming with Bitter Blossom tokens. The fairies and the Retrofitter Foundry tokens can, of course, either chump block or suit up. Second, let us look at a less typical control deck, Big Boros. This deck struggles to find cards, though Wall of Omens, Blast from the Past, and Mindstone replace themselves. Genju of the Fields is quite sticky, and land tax can draw a great many cards. This deck trades early blockers for white and red's cheap interaction. It is quite good at keeping the board clear. The deck's real strength is in ramping with mana rocks into disruptive spells, such as Balance and Burning of Junier. It finishes games with Assemble the Legion and Planeswalkers. Emissary of Grudges, as almost the deck's solitary creature, is a lightning rod, but the fact that it has haste and can protect itself means that it very likely gets in some damage, and it often functions as a 3-for-1. If you wish to continue cubing and playing Baneslayers, I entirely support that decision. I hope I have explained why I personally prefer more value-driven, stickier, or harder to remove threats. Difference in attitude towards Baneslayers often has everything to do with people's cube goals, which is a topic that my last video explores in depth. Please check out the Cultic Cube Patreon, and let's keep hanging out and chatting cube.